Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history, Arkansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the winter of 1899, a peculiar pattern began to emerge in the rural outskirts of Madison County, Arkansas, that would confound investigators for decades to come. Local records, discovered much later in a water-damaged archive during courthouse renovations in 1952, spoke of a modest two-story wooden house that sat approximately 3 miles from the nearest settlement of Huntsville. The property, measuring exactly 2 1/4 acres according to original surveyor notes, bordered what was then known as Willow Creek, a narrow waterway that meandered through the dense Arkansas woodland before disappearing into a series of underground caverns that honeycombed the limestone bedrock beneath much of Madison County. What made this particular dwelling noteworthy was not its architecture, which resembled countless other frontier homes constructed during the late 19th century expansion into Arkansas hill country, but rather the inexplicable and deadly sequence of events that befell every family who attempted to make it their permanent residence. The pattern was so consistent and disturbing that by 1930, local real estate records would show the property had been condemned by county authorities and removed from all taxation rolls, an unusual designation that remains in effect to this day. The house itself had been constructed during the harsh winter of 1891 by a traveling carpenter whose name appears in county records only as J. Whitmore, listed with no given name or place of origin. Local tax documents preserved in the basement files of the Madison County Courthouse indicate that Whitmore completed the entire structure working entirely alone, despite offers of assistance from neighboring homesteaders who were concerned about his welfare during what proved to be one of the coldest winters on record in the Arkansas hills. Contemporary accounts from the Huntsville Weekly Register described temperatures that remained below freezing for 6 consecutive weeks, conditions that should have made construction work nearly impossible for a single individual. The building featured standard amenities for its time period: a main floor containing a kitchen with wood-burning stove, a modest parlor with stone fireplace, and a smaller room that could serve as either storage or sleeping quarters depending on family needs. The upper floor contained 2 bedrooms of unequal size, connected by a narrow hallway that ran the length of the building. Most significantly, the house included an unusually elaborate root cellar, accessible through a heavy wooden door behind the kitchen and descended by means of stone steps cut directly into the limestone bedrock. This cellar extended approximately 15 feet below ground level, considerably deeper than was typical for food storage purposes in the region. The foundation, constructed entirely from local limestone, quarried from the hills surrounding Willow Creek, extended deeper into the ground than was customary for residential construction of the period. Whitmore had apparently excavated down to solid bedrock before beginning construction, a time-consuming process that helped explain the extended construction timeline, but also suggested an unusual level of concern for structural stability. The limestone blocks were fitted together with remarkable precision, using mortar mixed with local clay that created joints virtually impervious to moisture penetration under normal circumstances. Whitmore departed the region immediately upon completion of the house in early March 1892, leaving no forwarding address or explanation for his sudden departure. County records show that he sold the property to the local government for the unusually low sum of $47, an amount that barely covered his documented material costs and represented no compensation for the months of labor he had invested in the construction. Local residents who had interacted with him during the building process described him as a competent but unusually secretive individual who declined all social invitations and seemed eager to complete his work and leave the area as quickly as possible. The property remained vacant for nearly 7 years following Whitmore's departure, during which time it acquired something of a reputation among local residents as an unlucky or cursed location. This reputation was based not on any documented incidents during this period, but rather on the peculiar circumstances surrounding its construction and the builder's hasty departure. Several families expressed initial interest in purchasing the house during the 1890s, but all ultimately decided against the acquisition for reasons that were never clearly documented in available records. The first documented residents were Thomas and Margaret Henderson, a middle-aged couple who had migrated westward from Tennessee following the economic devastation that affected much of the rural South during the final decade of the 19th century. Thomas, aged 43 at the time of their arrival, had been a tobacco farmer before drought, and falling prices forced him to abandon his family's land and seek opportunities in the developing territories of Arkansas. Margaret, 2 years younger than her husband, had worked as a seamstress and maintained correspondence with relatives in Tennessee that would later provide crucial insight into the gradual changes that occurred during their residency. The Hendersons purchased the property in March of 1899 for the sum of $65, a price that county records indicate was approximately half the expected market value for a property of comparable size and condition. The sale transaction, documented in a deed preserved in the Madison County Courthouse, shows that they were informed about the house's previous vacancy, but were given no specific information about Whitmore's unusual behavior or hasty departure. Local real estate customs of the period did not require disclosure of such information, and there was no legal obligation to inform potential buyers about circumstances that had no direct bearing on the property's physical condition or legal status. The Hendersons moved their modest belongings into the house during the first week of April 1899, traveling by wagon from their temporary lodgings in Huntsville. Neighbors from surrounding farms recalled seeing smoke rising from the chimney and lamplight in the windows during evening hours, normal signs of domestic occupation that seemed to indicate successful adaptation to their new circumstances. Margaret Henderson was observed maintaining a small garden behind the house and was occasionally seen walking the narrow path that led down to Willow Creek, carrying what appeared to be washing or water buckets for household purposes. During their first months of residency, both Thomas and Margaret appeared to thrive in their new environment. Thomas found seasonal work with several local farmers, utilizing skills acquired during his years of tobacco cultivation in Tennessee. His employers described him as a reliable worker who understood agricultural timing and possessed the physical stamina necessary for the demanding labor required during planting and harvest seasons. Margaret quickly established cordial relationships with neighboring women, participating in the informal networks of mutual assistance that characterized rural communities of the period. Margaret's letters home to relatives in Tennessee during this early period, several of which were preserved by recipients and later donated to the Tennessee Historical Society, provide detailed descriptions of their daily routine and living conditions. She wrote enthusiastically about the house's comfortable interior, noting particularly the cool temperatures provided by the limestone foundation during the increasingly warm summer months. The root cellar, she reported, maintained a constant temperature that kept their food supplies fresh even during the hottest days, while the proximity to Willow Creek provided a reliable source of clean water for all household purposes. Thomas was described in Margaret's correspondence as genuinely pleased with their new circumstances and optimistic about their prospects for long-term success in Arkansas. He had begun to clear additional land for cultivation and spoke of eventually expanding their property through purchase of adjacent parcels that periodically became available as other homesteaders moved further west. Margaret herself expressed satisfaction with the house's layout and condition, noting only minor concerns about occasional dampness in the root cellar and an unusual echo that seemed to carry sounds from the lower level throughout the building during quiet evening hours. However, as autumn approached and the anniversary of their arrival drew near, subtle but troubling changes in their behavior became apparent to neighbors and business associates who interacted with them regularly. Thomas began to exhibit persistent fatigue that seemed disproportionate to his workload, often appearing pale and unsteady during tasks that he had previously performed with ease and confidence. His employers noted that he required more frequent rest periods and sometimes seemed confused about agricultural procedures that he had clearly understood and executed competently just weeks earlier. Margaret's letters home became noticeably less frequent during the late summer months, and their content shifted from detailed descriptions of daily activities to brief mentions of household concerns and increasing complaints about minor health problems. She began to describe difficulty sleeping through the night, attributing this problem to persistent headaches that seemed to worsen when she spent extended periods in the house, particularly in rooms adjacent to the root cellar. Her social interactions with neighboring women decreased gradually, with invitations to community gatherings and informal visits declined more often than accepted. The first winter of their residency proved particularly challenging for the Henderson household in ways that seemed to exceed the normal difficulties associated with seasonal weather changes in the Arkansas hills. Neighbors reported observing irregularities in the smoke patterns from their chimney, with periods of several days when no smoke was visible despite freezing temperatures that should have required constant heating for basic comfort and survival. When concerned community members made the journey to check on their welfare, they found both Thomas and Margaret responsive and apparently grateful for the attention, but visibly changed from their robust appearance of just months earlier. Thomas complained of joint pain that made physical labor increasingly difficult and sometimes impossible, describing symptoms that seemed to migrate throughout his body without settling in any specific location that might suggest injury or identifiable medical condition. Margaret reported episodes of dizziness and mental confusion that left her unable to complete familiar household tasks or maintain the organized routines that had characterized her domestic management during their early months of residency. Both had lost considerable weight despite having adequate food stores, and their complexions had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested underlying health problems of unknown origin. Most disturbing to visitors during this period was a change in the atmosphere of the house itself, which seemed to have developed characteristics that had not been present during the Hendersons' early months of apparently successful occupation. The root cellar, which Margaret had previously praised for its ideal storage conditions, began to emit an unusual odor that she described in her final preserved letter home as simultaneously sweet and unpleasant, reminiscent of overripe fruit, mixed with something she could not identify but found increasingly troubling. During the summer of 1900, the Hendersons' physical and mental condition continued to deteriorate in ways that puzzled neighbors, medical professionals, and the couple themselves. Thomas became increasingly unable to perform the agricultural work that had provided their primary source of income, citing severe joint pain, episodes of weakness that confined him to bed for days at a time, and a persistent tremor in his hands that made precise tasks impossible. Local physicians who examined him during this period attributed his symptoms to premature aging accelerated by the hardships of frontier life, but could offer no specific diagnosis or treatment recommendations. Margaret assumed greater responsibility for maintaining their household, but found herself similarly afflicted with physical and mental difficulties that seemed to worsen over time rather than responding to rest or traditional remedies. Her handwriting, preserved in her final letters home, became increasingly shaky and difficult to read, suggesting neurological problems that complemented her descriptions of memory difficulties and confusion about familiar tasks. Her final preserved correspondence, dated August 1900, mentions recurring nightmares featuring underground chambers filled with flowing water, dreams so vivid and disturbing that she sometimes woke uncertain about whether she remained asleep or had returned to waking consciousness. Neighbors who visited the Henderson house during this declining period consistently reported experiencing an atmosphere that seemed to differ markedly from typical domestic environments, though they struggled to identify specific factors that created this impression. The sweet, cloying odor that Margaret had mentioned became more pronounced, particularly in areas near the kitchen and around the entrance to the root cellar. Several visitors reported feeling slightly nauseated or dizzy after spending more than brief periods inside the house, though they generally attributed these reactions to emotional distress about the Hendersons' obvious deterioration rather than environmental factors that might affect their own well-being. The limestone walls, which had initially provided the pleasant cooling effect that Margaret had praised in her early letters, began to show signs of moisture accumulation that created patches of discoloration despite the house's relatively recent construction and initially sound condition. Windows that had previously been kept open for ventilation remained closed more frequently, contributing to a stuffy, oppressive atmosphere that made extended visits uncomfortable, even for neighbors genuinely concerned about the couple's welfare and eager to provide whatever assistance might prove helpful. As winter returned during their second year of residency, the Hendersons' isolation became nearly complete, with their contacts with the outside world limited to essential trips for supplies and occasional visits from neighbors who felt obligated to check on their condition. Their appearances in Huntsville became increasingly rare and shocking to merchants and community members who remembered their initial vitality and optimism. Both had become gaunt and moved with the careful, deliberate steps of individuals whose physical strength could no longer be taken for granted. Thomas developed a persistent cough that echoed across the surrounding fields during the quiet hours of early morning and late evening, a sound that neighbors found particularly disturbing given the otherwise peaceful character of the rural landscape. The cough seemed to worsen during periods when he spent extended time inside the house, leading him to seek relief by working outdoors even during weather conditions that should have driven any reasonable person to seek indoor shelter and warmth. Margaret was observed talking to herself during her increasingly rare visits to the general store in Huntsville, carrying on conversations that seemed to involve responses to unheard speakers and references to events or concerns that bore no apparent relationship to her immediate circumstances. Store owners noted that she sometimes appeared confused about items she had purchased regularly for months, requiring assistance with transactions that should have been routine and straightforward for someone who had demonstrated normal intelligence and competence in previous interactions. The discovery that would complete the first cycle of tragedy came in early March of 1906, exactly 7 years after the Hendersons had first taken residence in the house that would become their final home. Samuel Crawford, a neighboring farmer whose property adjoined the Henderson land along Willow Creek, had become concerned about the complete absence of any signs of life from the house for nearly 3 weeks. No smoke had been visible from the chimney, despite continued cold weather, and no one had responded to calls made from the property boundary during his routine travels along the creek path. Crawford made the decision to approach the house directly, discovering that the front door stood slightly ajar and moved gently in response to the March wind that swept down from the surrounding hills. His calls for the Hendersons received no response, prompting him to enter the house and search for its occupants. The interior appeared undisturbed, with no signs of struggle or violence, but the atmosphere seemed even more oppressive than visitors had reported during the final months of the Hendersons' lives. Crawford found both Thomas and Margaret in their bed, lying peacefully as though they had simply fallen asleep and never awakened. Dr. William Thornley, summoned from Huntsville to examine the scene, found both bodies in a state that suggested they had been deceased for approximately 2 weeks. Neither showed signs of injury or violence, but both appeared severely emaciated, despite the presence of adequate food supplies throughout the house. Their physical condition suggested malnutrition and dehydration that seemed inconsistent with their circumstances, creating questions that Dr. Thornley could not answer using medical knowledge available during the early years of the 20th century. The official cause of death was recorded as natural causes associated with general decline, though Dr. Thornley's private notes, discovered decades later in his personal papers donated to the University of Arkansas Medical School, reveal significant confusion about specific factors that might have contributed to the couple's deterioration and death. He noted particularly the unusual rapidity of their physical decline and the fact that both had died simultaneously, despite having no diagnosed medical conditions that would explain such a synchronized conclusion to their lives. The house stood empty for nearly 2 years following the Henderson tragedy, during which time its reputation within the local community shifted from merely unlucky to genuinely ominous. The property reverted to county ownership due to unpaid taxes, as the Hendersons had left no will and no identifiable heirs had come forward to claim their modest estate. Efforts to auction the house attracted minimal interest, partly due to its remote location, but increasingly because of growing awareness among potential buyers of the mysterious circumstances surrounding the previous residents' deaths. During this period of vacancy, the house began to show signs of deterioration that seemed disproportionate to the time it had stood empty. Paint on the exterior walls faded and peeled more rapidly than weather conditions alone should have caused, and several windows developed cracks despite the absence of any obvious impact or structural stress. Most significantly, neighbors reported that the unusual odor that had characterized the house during the Hendersons' final months seemed to persist and even intensify, becoming detectable from considerable distances during certain weather conditions. In the spring of 1908, the property was purchased by Daniel and Catherine Ashford, a recently married couple who represented everything that the Hendersons had not: youth, robust health, optimism, and sufficient financial resources to address any maintenance issues that might arise. Daniel, 26 years old and recently established as the region's most skilled blacksmith, possessed both the practical abilities and steady income necessary for successful homesteading. Catherine, barely 20 and reportedly in excellent health, brought to their marriage the energy and domestic skills that seemed to promise success in their new venture. The Ashfords acquired the property for $53, a price that reflected both its unfortunate reputation and the county's eagerness to return it to productive use and taxation rolls. Unlike the Hendersons, they were fully informed about the previous residents' deaths, but they approached this information with the confident rationality of young people convinced that proper management and modern understanding could overcome whatever factors had contributed to the earlier tragedy. Their attitude reflected broader cultural shifts of the early 20th century as scientific thinking began to replace superstitious explanations for natural phenomena. Daniel and Catherine moved into the house during the second week of May 1908, bringing with them ambitious plans for renovating and modernizing the property while maintaining its basic structural character. Daniel's blacksmithing business provided steady income that allowed them to purchase materials and supplies that the Hendersons could never have afforded, while Catherine's domestic skills and boundless energy seemed ideally suited to the challenges of establishing and maintaining a comfortable home in a demanding rural environment. Their initial months in the house proceeded with a success that seemed to vindicate their optimistic approach to the property's troubled history. Daniel's business expanded rapidly as farmers throughout Madison County brought equipment for repair and modification, drawn by his reputation for innovative solutions to agricultural challenges. His outdoor forge, established near the house but separated from it by sufficient distance to minimize fire hazard, became a gathering point for local men who appreciated both his craftsmanship and his willingness to share knowledge about metalworking techniques. Catherine focused her considerable energy on establishing a productive garden that quickly surpassed anything that had been attempted on the property during previous residencies. Her knowledge of soil management and plant cultivation, acquired during her childhood on her family's farm, enabled her to produce vegetables in quantities sufficient not only for their household needs but also for sale at markets in Huntsville and surrounding communities. The additional income supplemented Daniel's blacksmithing earnings and provided financial security that neither the Hendersons nor Whitmore had enjoyed. The house itself seemed to benefit dramatically from the Ashfords' attention and investment. Fresh paint was applied to both interior and exterior surfaces, eliminating the peeling and discoloration that had developed during the period of vacancy. Broken windows were replaced with new glass, and minor structural repairs were completed using Daniel's metalworking skills and Catherine's knowledge of household maintenance. Most significantly, their restoration work appeared to eliminate completely the persistent odor that had troubled visitors during the Henderson residency, suggesting that proper care and ventilation could resolve whatever environmental factors had contributed to the earlier problems. Neighbors commented favorably on the improvements and expressed genuine hope that the property's unfortunate history would prove to be an aberration rather than an indication of fundamental problems with the location or structure. The Ashfords' obvious competence and dedication seemed to offer proof that the Henderson tragedy had resulted from factors specific to that couple's circumstances rather than inherent characteristics of the property itself. Community members began to view the earlier deaths as genuinely unfortunate but isolated incidents that bore no necessary relationship to future occupants who approached the property with proper preparation and realistic expectations. However, as winter approached during their first year of residency, observers with long memories began to notice subtle changes that echoed patterns established during the Henderson years. Daniel's customers reported that his work remained of high quality, but required longer completion times than had been typical during his first months of operation. Projects that he had previously completed with obvious ease and confidence now seemed to demand greater concentration and multiple attempts to achieve satisfactory results. His conversation, formerly characterized by quick wit and confident expertise, became more hesitant and occasionally seemed to lose focus during technical discussions. Catherine's garden management, which had been exemplary throughout the growing season, became less consistent as autumn progressed. Vegetables that should have been harvested at optimal ripeness were left on plants until they began to deteriorate, and preservation tasks that she had previously completed with methodical efficiency were postponed or handled carelessly. Neighbors who visited during this period noted that the interior of the house had begun to develop atmospheric characteristics reminiscent of the Henderson years, including the return of the subtle but unpleasant odor that had been eliminated during their spring restoration efforts. The changes accelerated during the winter months, following a pattern that older residents found disturbingly familiar, despite their hopes that the Ashfords' youth and competence would prove sufficient to break the cycle that had claimed their predecessors. Daniel's blacksmithing business began to decline as his ability to maintain the concentration required for complex metalwork became increasingly compromised. He complained of persistent headaches that seemed to worsen when he spent extended periods inside the house, finding temporary relief only when working at his outdoor forge or traveling to other properties for business purposes. Catherine experienced parallel difficulties, describing episodes of confusion and disorientation that interfered with household tasks she had previously managed without conscious effort. Her correspondence with family members, preserved in the Ashford family papers donated to the Arkansas Historical Society, documents a gradual decline in her ability to maintain the detailed organization that had characterized her domestic management during their early months of marriage. Both began to lose weight despite having abundant food supplies, and their formerly robust health gave way to a pallor and general weakness that reminded longtime community members of the Hendersons' final months. By the spring of 1909, the Ashfords had become significantly more isolated from community life, with their social interactions limited primarily to essential business transactions and brief encounters with immediate neighbors. Daniel's blacksmithing operation had essentially ceased regular production, forcing customers to seek services elsewhere despite their preference for his superior craftsmanship. Catherine rarely ventured beyond the immediate boundaries of their property, spending increasing amounts of time inside the house despite the pleasant spring weather that should have encouraged outdoor activities and social contact. The pattern of gradual decline continued relentlessly through the following years, creating a sense of inevitable tragedy among community members who had hoped that the Ashfords' advantages would enable them to succeed where the Hendersons had failed. The house itself began to reflect their deteriorating condition, with maintenance tasks postponed and repairs left incomplete despite Daniel's obvious skills and Catherine's former commitment to domestic excellence. The garden that had been Catherine's pride became overgrown and unproductive, while the path to Willow Creek disappeared beneath encroaching vegetation. Most disturbing to neighbors was the return of environmental conditions that had characterized the house during the Henderson tragedy. The persistent odor became more pronounced, particularly in areas near the kitchen and around the root cellar entrance, while windows remained closed even during mild weather that should have encouraged ventilation. The root cellar door was frequently observed standing open for extended periods, contributing to the damp, oppressive atmosphere that made visits to the house increasingly unpleasant, even for neighbors genuinely concerned about the couple's welfare. The second tragedy occurred in May of 1915, precisely 7 years after the Ashfords had first moved into the house with such optimism and apparent advantages over their predecessors. The discovery was made by Reverend James Morrison, a traveling minister who made regular circuits through rural areas to provide spiritual guidance to isolated homesteaders who rarely had access to organized religious services. Arriving at the Ashford property during his scheduled visit, he found circumstances that would prove remarkably similar to those that had concluded the Henderson residency. Both Daniel and Catherine were discovered in their bed, apparently having died peacefully in their sleep with no signs of struggle or violence to suggest external causes for their deaths. Their physical condition, however, told a different story that Dr. Thornley found deeply troubling when he was again summoned to examine residents of the same house. Both bodies showed signs of severe malnutrition and dehydration that seemed inconsistent with their circumstances, as adequate food and water supplies were present throughout the house. Their hair had become thin and brittle, and their skin showed unusual discoloration that suggested systemic problems of unknown origin. Dr. Thornley's examination revealed additional details that had not been documented during his investigation of the Henderson deaths. Both bodies exhibited signs of what he described as premature aging, with tissue deterioration that seemed to exceed normal expectations, even accounting for their obvious ill health during their final months. Most significantly, he noted that their deaths appeared to have occurred simultaneously, a coincidence that he found medically improbable, given the absence of any identified illness or external factor that might affect both individuals equally. Following the Ashfords' deaths, county authorities initiated a more systematic investigation of the property than had been conducted after the Henderson incident. The investigation was prompted by the obvious similarities between the two cases and growing pressure from community members who demanded explanations for the repeated tragedies. Commissioner Harold Watson, recently elected on a platform of bringing modern administrative methods to county government, approached the situation with a determination to identify rational explanations for events that local residents were increasingly attributing to supernatural causes. The house was inspected thoroughly by a team that included Dr. Thornley, a structural engineer borrowed from the State Highway Department, and a recently graduated chemistry teacher from the Regional Normal School who possessed knowledge of analytical techniques that had not been available during the earlier investigation. Their examination revealed that the basic structure remained sound, with no obvious defects in construction or materials that might explain the health problems experienced by residents. The well water was tested using improved methods and found to be safe for consumption, while the food supplies discovered in the house showed no signs of contamination or spoilage. However, the investigation team noted several features of the house that had not been adequately documented during previous examinations. The root cellar was found to extend more deeply into the ground than had been recorded in original construction documents, reaching down to the limestone bedrock that formed the foundation for the entire structure. More significantly, careful measurement revealed that the cellar floor lay below the normal water level of Willow Creek, creating conditions that might allow groundwater to seep into the storage area during certain seasons or weather conditions. The investigation also documented unusual characteristics of the limestone formation that supported the house, including evidence of extensive underground chambers that connected the immediate area to a broader cave system extending throughout the surrounding hills. While such formations were common in Arkansas geology, the specific configuration beneath the house appeared to create unique conditions that might affect air circulation and moisture control within the structure above. The persistent odor that had been reported during both residencies was tentatively attributed to gases emanating from these underground chambers. Though the investigation team lacked the scientific equipment necessary to identify specific chemical compounds or assess their potential health effects. Commissioner Watson's final report, submitted to state authorities in Little Rock during the autumn of 1915, concluded that the house occupied a location where natural geological conditions created an environment potentially harmful to long-term human habitation. While no definitive cause of death could be established for either the Henderson or Ashford families, the report recommended that the property be condemned and removed from residential use until more thorough scientific investigation could be conducted using resources beyond those available to county government. This recommendation was not immediately implemented due to legal complications surrounding property rights and the absence of specific evidence demonstrating immediate danger to potential occupants. The house remained empty for nearly 5 years while these issues were debated in county and state courts, during which time its condition deteriorated significantly. Weather damage, vandalism, and simple neglect transformed the structure from a modest but comfortable home into a building that appeared far older and more deteriorated than its actual age would suggest. During this extended vacancy, reports began to circulate about unusual phenomena observed in the vicinity of the abandoned house. Neighbors reported strange sounds emanating from the direction of the property during quiet evening hours, sounds that some described as resembling voices or flowing water, but which no one could locate or explain. Hunters and hikers who passed through the area mentioned feeling uncomfortable or disoriented when approaching the house. Though such reports were generally attributed to knowledge of its tragic history rather than environmental factors that might affect visitors' well-being. In 1920, despite the official recommendation that had resulted from the 1915 investigation, the property was purchased by Edward and Helen Morrison, a couple whose confidence in modern scientific understanding led them to dismiss earlier problems as coincidental misfortunes that bore no relation to their own prospects for success. Edward was a military veteran whose service in the recent world conflict had given him experience with challenging environments and confidence in his ability to overcome obstacles through practical application of acquired skills. Helen was known among their former neighbors in Missouri as a woman of exceptional strength and determination, qualities that seemed to make her ideally suited to the demands of frontier living. The Morrisons approached their purchase of the property with full knowledge of its unfortunate history, but with conviction that proper management and modern techniques could resolve whatever factors had contributed to the earlier tragedies. They acquired the house and land for $38, a price that reflected both its deteriorated condition and its reputation among local residents who continued to regard it as fundamentally unsafe for human habitation. Their decision to purchase and occupy the property was viewed by many community members as either courageous or foolhardy, depending on individual attitudes toward scientific explanations for natural phenomena. Edward and Helen invested considerable time, effort, and financial resources in restoring the house to habitable condition, approaching the task with systematic thoroughness that reflected Edward's military training and Helen's domestic expertise. They replaced damaged roofing materials, repaired or replaced broken windows, and applied fresh paint to both interior and exterior surfaces. Most significantly, they implemented what they believed to be solutions for the environmental problems that had been identified during the 1915 investigation, including improved ventilation systems and modifications to the root cellar designed to prevent moisture accumulation and gas emissions. Their restoration efforts appeared initially successful, eliminating the atmospheric problems that had characterized the house during previous occupancies and creating living conditions that seemed comfortable and healthy. The persistent odor that had troubled visitors during both earlier residencies was completely absent during the Morrisons' first months of occupancy, while improved lighting and ventilation made the interior spaces pleasant and inviting. Their success seemed to validate the belief that scientific understanding and practical intervention could overcome natural conditions that had proved fatal to previous residents who lacked the knowledge and resources necessary to address underlying problems. The Morrisons' first year in the house proceeded without incident, providing what appeared to be definitive proof that the earlier tragedies had resulted from correctable environmental factors rather than inherent characteristics of the location that might doom any attempt at permanent habitation. Edward's employment with local farmers was steady and remunerative, while Helen's garden produced vegetables in quantities that exceeded even Catherine Ashford's successful efforts. Their obvious prosperity and continued good health seemed to demonstrate that the property's reputation for bringing misfortune to its residents was based on superstition rather than objective reality. Community members began to express genuine optimism that the cycle of tragedy had been permanently broken through the application of modern knowledge and proper management techniques. The Morrisons were regarded as examples of how scientific thinking and practical competence could overcome challenges that had defeated less prepared predecessors. Their success encouraged other families to consider purchasing property in the surrounding area, contributing to a modest expansion of settlement that brought additional residents to the previously isolated region around Willow Creek. However, as their second winter in the house approached, the same pattern of gradual decline that had characterized both previous residencies began to manifest itself with a consistency that troubled observers who had hoped the cycle had been permanently interrupted. Edward's work performance, which had been exemplary throughout his first year, became increasingly variable, with employers noting periods of confusion and fatigue that seemed inconsistent with his military training and proven reliability. Tasks that he had previously completed with efficient competence now required multiple attempts and seemed to exhaust him beyond reasonable expectations. Helen's domestic management, formerly characterized by the systematic organization that had enabled her to exceed Catherine Ashford's agricultural achievements became less consistent and eventually chaotic. Household routines that she had maintained effortlessly during their first year began to be neglected or forgotten, while her correspondence with family members in Missouri became increasingly brief and infrequent. Both began to lose weight and develop the pallor that had characterized their predecessors during their final months, changes that occurred despite continued access to abundant food supplies and medical attention when needed. Most disturbing to neighbors and visitors was the gradual return of environmental conditions that had been eliminated during the Morrisons' initial restoration efforts. The persistent odor that had troubled previous residents reappeared despite continued operation of the improved ventilation systems that Edward had installed. The root cellar modifications that were intended to prevent moisture accumulation and gas emissions proved ineffective over time, with conditions in the lower level reverting to those that had existed during earlier occupancies. The deterioration accelerated during subsequent years, following the trajectory that had characterized both previous cycles, despite the Morrisons' initial advantages in health, knowledge, and financial resources. Edward's military bearing gave way to the stooped posture and uncertain movements that had marked his predecessors during their final years of residence. Helen's robust constitution and confident manner deteriorated into chronic weakness and increasing withdrawal from social contact. Their conversation became increasingly difficult to follow, often focusing on concerns or experiences that seemed to have little relation to their actual circumstances. By their 5th year of residence, the Morrisons had become as isolated and physically compromised as both previous families had been during their final periods of occupancy. Edward's employment had ceased entirely due to his inability to perform physical labor or maintain the concentration required for agricultural work. Helen rarely ventured beyond the immediate vicinity of the house and appeared uncomfortable during the brief social interactions that occurred when neighbors visited to check on their condition. Their appearance shocked community members who remembered their initial vitality and optimism. As both had aged in ways that seemed to exceed normal expectations, even accounting for the stresses associated with rural living and economic hardship. The third tragedy occurred during the summer of 1927, completing the 7-year pattern that had now claimed 3 families over a period of nearly 3 decades. County Surveyor Robert Hayes discovered both Edward and Helen in circumstances that were virtually identical to those that had characterized the deaths of their predecessors, lying peacefully in their bed with no evidence of violence or struggle. Dr. Thornley, now in his 70s but still serving as the region's primary medical authority, immediately recognized the similarities to the earlier cases and documented his findings with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that he was observing a pattern that demanded explanation. Both bodies showed the same signs of severe malnutrition and dehydration that had characterized all previous victims, despite the presence of adequate food and water supplies throughout the house. Their hair had become thin and colorless, while their skin exhibited the unusual discoloration that Dr. Thornley had noted in earlier examinations but had been unable to explain using medical knowledge available during the early decades of the 20th century. Most significantly, their deaths had apparently occurred simultaneously, continuing the pattern of synchronized mortality that had puzzled investigators since the Henderson tragedy more than 20 years earlier. Following this third incident, state authorities in Little Rock authorized a comprehensive scientific investigation of the property using resources and expertise that had not been available to previous inquiries. The investigation team included geological specialists from the University of Arkansas, medical researchers from the State Health Department, and chemical analysts equipped with laboratory equipment that enabled identification of environmental factors that might affect human health over extended periods of exposure. Their mandate was to determine definitively whether natural conditions at the property posed dangers to human habitation, and if so, to recommend appropriate measures for protecting public safety. The investigation revealed that the house had been constructed over a complex geological formation that created unique and potentially dangerous environmental conditions for long-term residents. The limestone bedrock beneath the structure contained an extensive system of underground chambers and passages that connected to Willow Creek and extended throughout the surrounding hills. These underground spaces functioned as conduits for groundwater movement and provided pathways for gases generated by natural chemical processes occurring within the limestone formations. Analysis of air samples collected throughout the house revealed elevated concentrations of naturally occurring compounds that could cause serious health problems through prolonged exposure. These substances, while not immediately toxic, accumulated in human tissue over time and eventually reached levels that compromised immune function and interfered with normal cellular processes. The 7-year pattern that had characterized all three tragedies was explained by medical consultants as representing the approximate time required for these compounds to reach concentrations sufficient to cause the organ failure and systemic breakdown that had killed all previous residents. The root cellar, extending directly into the limestone formation, served as the primary entry point for these dangerous emissions, though the entire house was affected due to air circulation patterns that distributed contaminated air throughout all interior spaces. The persistent odor that had been reported during all three residencies was identified as a warning sign indicating the presence of these harmful compounds, though previous residents had lacked the knowledge necessary to recognize its significance or take appropriate protective measures. The investigation's findings were documented in a comprehensive report submitted to the Arkansas State Legislature during the winter of 1928. The report concluded that the house occupied a location where natural geological processes created conditions fundamentally incompatible with safe human habitation, and recommended that the property be permanently condemned and removed from residential use. Based on these findings, the legislature passed emergency legislation authorizing county authorities to demolish the structure and seal the underground chambers that had been identified as the source of the dangerous emissions. The house was demolished during the spring of 1928, with particular attention paid to sealing the root cellar and preventing future access to the underground chambers that had caused 3 decades of tragedy. The limestone foundation was broken up and the cellar was filled with concrete, while the entrance to the underground system was sealed permanently using techniques recommended by geological specialists. The land was designated as unsuitable for residential construction and was eventually incorporated into a state-owned wilderness preserve that would prevent any future attempt to build human habitation in the dangerous area. The case of the Arkansas house was documented in scientific literature and contributed to improved understanding of geological hazards that might affect residential construction in regions with limestone cave systems. The pattern of illness and death that had characterized the property was recognized as representing environmental poisoning caused by naturally occurring chemical compounds rather than supernatural forces or deliberate human action. The systematic investigation that followed the third tragedy established principles and procedures that continue to guide environmental health research and residential safety regulation throughout the southeastern United States. The memory of Thomas and Margaret Henderson, Daniel and Catherine Ashford, and Edward and Helen Morrison has faded from local consciousness, though their names remain preserved in county records and cemetery registers scattered throughout Madison County. Their individual stories serve as reminders of the hidden dangers that can exist in apparently benign environments and of the importance of understanding natural phenomena before attempting to establish permanent human habitation in locations where geological processes might create conditions hostile to human life. The site where the house once stood remains undeveloped as part of the State Wilderness Preserve, with the sealed foundation visible only as a slight rectangular depression overgrown with native vegetation. Willow Creek continues to flow through the area, its course permanently altered by diversions implemented during the remediation project of 1928. The limestone cave system continues to exist beneath the surface, though access points have been sealed to prevent future exposure to the conditions that proved fatal to 9 people over the course of nearly 3 decades.